She smiled before the truth arrived. The chapel was so quiet that morning I could hear the soft crackle of candle flames long before I noticed the whispers spreading through the rows of polished wooden pews. White lilies surrounded Thomas's casket, filling the air with a sweet fragrance that somehow made the ache in my chest feel even heavier.
I promise
We had been
I will.
married for 42 years. 42 Christmas mornings, 42 wedding anniversaries, thousands of ordinary evenings spent sharing coffee on our back porch while watching the Kentucky sunset disappear behind the maple trees. Now all that remained was a framed photograph beside his casket and a wedding ring that suddenly felt far too heavy on my trembling hand. I sat in the front row wearing the black dress Thomas once told me made me look elegant because it reminded him that grace never needed bright colors. My son Daniel sat a few seats away, staring at the floor with tired eyes, saying almost nothing to anyone who approached him. Beside him sat his wife, Rebecca. She looked immaculate. Every strand of her dark hair rested perfectly beneath her designer hat, and her expensive black dress seemed chosen more for a magazine cover than for saying goodbye to family. While guests quietly shared memories of Thomas, Rebecca walked confidently from one conversation to another as though she were already hosting the gathering herself. She thanked people for coming before I even had the chance. She answered questions directed at me. She accepted condolences with a polite smile that somehow never reached her eyes. More than once I noticed confused friends glance toward me as if wondering why the widow remained silent while someone else spoke on behalf of the family. I lowered my gaze and folded my hands together. Grief has a strange way of stealing your voice. Or perhaps wisdom simply teaches you that not every moment deserves an immediate answer. As the minister finished his final prayer, people slowly began standing. Chairs shifted softly against the floor. The organ music faded into silence. That should have been the moment everyone quietly walked outside, toward the cemetery. Instead, Rebecca stepped toward the front of the chapel before anyone else could move. She reached for the small microphone resting near the podium and smiled with a confidence that instantly made something tighten inside my chest. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Even Daniel looked surprised, although he made no attempt to stop her. Rebecca cleared her throat and looked across the room as though she had rehearsed every word. Thomas always wanted everything handled efficiently, she said. He trusted me to keep this family moving forward, and I'll make sure everything he built stays exactly where it belongs. A murmur spread through the chapel. Someone behind me quietly whispered that it sounded like a business meeting instead of a funeral. Rebecca continued speaking, thanking people for supporting what she called our family's next chapter. Every sentence felt carefully chosen, polished until it sounded reasonable on the surface, while carrying an entirely different meaning underneath. I watched her face instead of listening to every word. Confidence can sometimes reveal more than honesty ever could. She truly believed no one would question her. She truly believed the story had already ended. I felt tears gathering in my eyes, but not because of Rebecca. I was remembering Thomas during his final week at home. Even when illness had drained nearly all his strength, he had squeezed my hand one evening and smiled with quiet certainty. "Promise me one thing, Maggie," he had whispered. "No matter what happens afterward, don't rush. Time always exposes what pride tries to hide." At the time, I thought he was simply comforting me. Sitting there in the chapel, watching Rebecca speak as though she already owned every memory we had built together, those words suddenly returned with startling clarity. I gently touched the folded funeral program resting in my lap and took a slow breath. Rebecca believed she was standing at the finish line. She never realized she had just taken the very first step into a story Thomas had quietly prepared long before any of us understood why. After the last guest quietly drifted toward the parking lot, I remained seated for several minutes, unable to convince myself that standing up would somehow make Thomas's absence easier to accept. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting soft patches of blue and gold across the wooden floor. For decades we had attended services together in this same chapel, always sitting side by side, always leaving hand in hand. Walking out alone felt like crossing an invisible line into a life I had never wanted. Daniel finally approached me, avoiding my eyes as he gently rested his hand on my shoulder. He asked whether I was ready to leave, but there was a distance in his voice that I had never heard before. It sounded rehearsed, almost careful, as though every word had first been approved by someone else. I nodded without speaking. Outside, a cool autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the church grounds. Friends embraced me one by one, offering quiet condolences and promising to call soon. Rebecca accepted every expression of sympathy directed toward our family with polished confidence. More than once I watched strangers assume she was making the important decisions while I simply stood beside her like a guest at my own husband's farewell. During the drive home, Daniel kept both hands tightly on the steering wheel. The silence inside the car stretched for miles. Normally Thomas would have broken that silence with one of his terrible jokes, smiling proudly even when nobody laughed except him. I found myself staring out the passenger window at familiar roads, realizing that every landmark carried a memory. The small diner where Thomas insisted they serve the best apple pie in the county. The hardware store where he somehow always spent twice as much time as he promised. The old oak tree where he taught Daniel to ride a bicycle. Every memory now felt suspended between gratitude and grief. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Rebecca immediately taking charge again. She instructed the catering company where to unload the food prepared for visitors. She directed relatives toward different rooms inside the house. She even told a florist where another arrangement should be placed in the living room without asking whether I preferred it. Somewhere else. It was still my home, yet every decision seemed to happen around me instead of with me. I quietly removed my coat and hung it in the hallway closet. My fingers brushed against one of Thomas's old jackets. It still carried the faint scent of cedar and coffee. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to remember an ordinary Saturday morning just 1 month earlier. Thomas had been sitting on the back porch wrapped in his favorite flannel blanket while I poured fresh coffee into 2 chipped mugs we refused to replace because they had traveled with us through nearly 20 years of family breakfasts. He looked tired that morning, far more tired than he admitted. The illness had slowly stolen his strength, but it had never stolen his kindness. He reached across the little table and squeezed my hand. "Promise me you will keep noticing the small things," he said softly. I laughed and asked what that was supposed to mean. He smiled in the patient way he always did whenever he knew something I did not. People reveal themselves through little choices long before they reveal themselves through big ones. At the time I assumed he was talking about life in general. Now those words echoed differently inside my heart. Standing in our quiet hallway, I began replaying dozens of moments from the past several months. Rebecca insisting on organizing Thomas's appointments. Rebecca volunteering to answer his telephone because he needed more rest. Rebecca offering to handle financial paperwork so neither of us would have to worry. Every individual gesture had seemed thoughtful by itself. Together they formed a pattern I had never stopped long enough to examine. I carried that uncomfortable realization with me as I slowly climbed the staircase toward our bedroom. The house felt painfully still without Thomas's voice drifting from another room, yet beneath the silence another feeling quietly emerged. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the uneasy sense that my husband had been trying to leave me a warning long before he left me goodbye. The following morning I woke before sunrise, expecting to hear Thomas moving quietly through the kitchen the way he always had. For one peaceful second my mind believed nothing had changed. Then the silence reminded me that I was alone. I remained sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty pillow beside mine until the first pale light crept through the curtains. Downstairs the coffee maker still worked exactly as it always had, but even the familiar aroma could not warm the strange emptiness filling every room. I carried my mug onto the back porch where Thomas and I had spent countless mornings planning gardens, talking about vacations we never quite took, or simply enjoying the sound of birds waking before the rest of the neighborhood. That morning the porch felt larger than I remembered. Across the yard the maple tree had already begun dropping bright red leaves onto the grass. Thomas always said autumn was honest because trees never pretended to hold on longer than they could. Around 8 o'clock I heard the front door open without anyone knocking. Rebecca stepped inside, carrying several folders pressed neatly against her chest. Daniel followed a few steps behind, looking exhausted after another sleepless night. Rebecca offered me a sympathetic smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "There are so many things we should organize while everything is still fresh," she said gently. "It will make life much easier for everyone." Before I could answer, she walked directly into Thomas's home office, as though she had every right to be there. I slowly followed, watching her open desk drawers with surprising confidence. She sorted papers into neat piles, setting some aside while placing others into her own folder. Every movement seemed practiced rather than uncertain. Daniel quietly helped carry several file boxes into the hallway, without asking whether I wanted anything left where Thomas had kept it. I stood in the doorway feeling like a visitor watching strangers rearrange a museum dedicated to my own life. When I finally asked what they were looking for, Rebecca answered without even raising her eyes from the paperwork. "Just the important financial records. There is no reason for you to worry about all these complicated details right now." Her voice remained pleasant, but the words settled heavily inside me. Thomas had spent decades teaching me every investment, every mortgage payment, every retirement account. He never believed one spouse should be left in the dark. There had never been anything complicated about our finances because we had always handled them together. I quietly crossed the room toward Thomas's desk. The small brass compass he kept beside his calendar was gone. So was the leather notebook where he wrote reminders every evening before bed. I asked Daniel whether he had seen either item. He frowned for a moment before glancing toward Rebecca. She answered for him. "I packed a few personal things for safekeeping. We can sort through sentimental items later." The phrase sentimental items echoed strangely in my mind. To Rebecca, they were objects. To me, they were pieces of a marriage that had lasted nearly half a century. Around lunchtime, neighbors began stopping by with casseroles, homemade bread, and handwritten sympathy cards. While I thanked each person, Rebecca politely intercepted several conversations, explaining that she would coordinate future visits because I needed uninterrupted time to grieve. More than once I noticed friends hesitate before handing envelopes to her instead of me. She accepted them naturally, smiling as though she had become the family's official gatekeeper overnight. After everyone left, I walked upstairs intending to rest for an hour. As I reached the landing, I noticed our bedroom door standing slightly open. Inside, one side of Thomas's closet was empty. His favorite jackets, several pairs of shoes, and even the old fishing hat he refused to throw away had disappeared. My heart skipped. I hurried downstairs and asked Daniel where his father's clothes had gone. He looked genuinely confused before turning toward Rebecca. She calmly explained that donating them quickly would help everyone heal instead of dwelling on the past. I stared at her, unable to understand how 42 years of shared memories could be reduced to a task on someone's checklist. Daniel lowered his eyes without saying a word. In that painful silence, I realized something far more troubling than grief itself. Rebecca was no longer simply helping after a family loss. She had quietly begun deciding which parts of Thomas's life deserved to remain and which parts could disappear forever. That evening, I could not bring myself to sleep in our bedroom. Instead, I wrapped myself in one of the quilts my mother had stitched decades ago and settled into the old armchair in the den where Thomas often read before bedtime. The room still held the faint scent of cedar from the bookcases he had built with his own hands. Every shelf carried little reminders of our life together. A photograph from our first camping trip in the Smoky Mountains. A baseball signed by Daniel when he was 12 years old. A brass clock that had stopped working years ago but remained on the mantel because Thomas insisted some things were too meaningful to replace. I closed my eyes and let the silence carry me backward through the years. Thomas had never been a man of grand speeches. He believed love revealed itself through ordinary routines repeated faithfully over time. Every Sunday morning, he made blueberry pancakes, even after retiring. Every spring, he planted tomato seedlings, although he always complained about the squirrels stealing the first ripe ones. Every anniversary, he wrote me a handwritten letter instead of buying an expensive gift because he believed words lasted longer than jewelry. During the final months of his illness, those letters became shorter, yet somehow more thoughtful. One rainy afternoon, while we watched water collect along the porch railing, he reached into his sweater pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. On it, he had written only one sentence: "The strongest roots grow where nobody thinks to look." I laughed softly and asked whether he had suddenly become a philosopher. He smiled and folded the note back into his pocket. Maybe I have finally learned that life hides its greatest answers beneath ordinary moments. I thought he was simply reflecting on growing older. Looking back now, I wondered whether he had been trying to tell me something far more important. The following morning, I wandered into his workshop behind the garage, searching for the comfort of familiar memories. Sunlight slipped through the dusty windows, illuminating shelves lined with carefully labeled jars of screws, nails, and tiny pieces of hardware collected over 40 years. Thomas believed every tool deserved a proper place because someday someone would need it. I ran my fingertips across his workbench until they stopped beside a small wooden box carved with our initials. It was empty. I remembered seeing it there only a few weeks before. That alone might not have meant anything, except another memory quietly surfaced. 3 months before he passed away, Thomas had asked me an unusual question while we were cleaning the garage together. "If you ever cannot find what you expect," he had said, "promise me you will look for what nobody else notices." I teased him for talking in riddles, and he only laughed before changing the subject to whether the lawnmower needed new spark plugs. At the time, I dismissed it as another one of his quirky observations. Now, every strange conversation returned with new meaning. As I locked the workshop door behind me, I noticed Rebecca standing near the kitchen window speaking quietly on her telephone. She ended the call the instant she saw me. Her smile appeared a fraction too late. "I was just arranging a meeting with an estate consultant," she explained. "There are so many legal details to manage." I simply nodded. Arguing would have accomplished nothing, because I still lacked the one thing Thomas valued above emotion: evidence. Throughout lunch, Rebecca continued discussing paperwork, insurance forms, property records, and deadlines that apparently required immediate attention. Daniel remained unusually quiet, answering mostly with brief nods while staring into his untouched coffee. More than once he looked toward me as though he wanted to speak, yet every time Rebecca gently redirected the conversation toward practical matters. Watching them together reminded me of something Thomas once told me after Daniel married. "Our son has a generous heart," he had whispered one evening. "Generous people sometimes mistake confidence for wisdom." I had defended Rebecca then, believing every new family needed time to adjust. Sitting across the table now, I realized Thomas had noticed subtle changes long before I ever did. He had never criticized her directly. He had simply observed. And Thomas rarely observed anything without a reason. By late afternoon, I understood that grief had been quietly giving way to something else. The memories I once believed were nothing more than tender moments between husband and wife were slowly fitting together, like pieces of a puzzle. Thomas had not spent his final months speaking in mysteries because illness clouded his mind. He had been leaving a trail, trusting that one day I would finally understand where it led. The house felt unusually quiet on the third morning after everyone returned to their own routines. Rebecca had left early with Daniel, saying they needed to meet with someone about paperwork, although neither of them explained exactly what kind of paperwork could not wait another day. I welcomed the silence. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I was alone with my thoughts instead of everyone else's plans. I carried a cup of coffee into the living room and noticed the stack of sympathy cards still resting on the side table exactly where I had placed them after the service. I decided to read each one slowly, grateful for every handwritten memory friends had chosen to share. Halfway through the pile, the telephone rang. The familiar voice on the other end immediately brought a sense of calm I had not realized I needed. "Margaret, this is Michael Harper," he said gently. Thomas's attorney had represented our family for nearly 25 years. He had helped us buy our first rental property, prepared our wills, and patiently answered every legal question Thomas ever asked. His voice carried the same quiet steadiness that had always earned my trust. He offered his condolences before asking whether I would be available to meet privately that afternoon. There was something careful about the way he chose his words. He did not sound hurried, but neither did he sound casual. I agreed, without hesitation. We met at a small coffee shop just outside town where Thomas and I occasionally stopped after church on Sunday mornings. Michael was already waiting when I arrived, sitting near the window with 2 untouched cups of coffee on the table. His expression was kind, yet unusually thoughtful. After we exchanged a few quiet memories about Thomas, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Margaret," he said softly, "before we discuss anything else, I need to ask you one important question. Has anyone pressured you to sign documents since Thomas passed away?" The question caught me completely by surprise. I shook my head and explained that Rebecca had been eager to organize financial records and household paperwork, but nobody had actually placed anything in front of me to sign. Michael nodded slowly, almost as though my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He reached into his leather briefcase and removed a sealed manila envelope with Thomas's name written neatly across the front in familiar handwriting. My heart skipped. I recognized those careful letters instantly. Thomas had labeled every important file exactly the same way for decades. Michael rested one hand on the envelope without opening it. "Thomas gave this to me several months ago," he explained. "He instructed me very clearly that I was not to deliver it until after his funeral and only after speaking with you privately." I stared at the envelope without reaching for it. My fingers trembled against the warm coffee cup. Michael continued carefully. "He also told me something I have been thinking about ever since. He said that if certain people began acting too quickly after his passing, I should ask you to be patient and not react emotionally. He believed patience would reveal far more than confrontation." A long silence settled between us. Outside the window, people walked along the sidewalk carrying grocery bags and chatting about ordinary things, completely unaware that my entire understanding of the past few days was quietly changing. I finally asked Michael whether Thomas had expected problems within the family. Michael chose his words with remarkable care. "Thomas never made accusations," he answered. "He simply believed that character often reveals itself when people think no one is watching." Those words sounded exactly like something my husband would have said. Michael gently slid the sealed envelope toward me, but did not encourage me to open it. "Not yet," he said. "Thomas wanted you to read this only after you had enough time to observe what was happening around you. He believed you would recognize certain patterns on your own." I rested my hand on the envelope, feeling the raised edge of the seal beneath my fingertips. For the first time since losing Thomas, I no longer felt completely alone. He had somehow anticipated the confusion, the quiet power struggle unfolding inside our family, and even the fear that I might begin doubting my own judgment. As I looked at the envelope resting between us, I realized my husband had not left me searching for answers without guidance. He had quietly arranged for the first piece of the truth to find me exactly when I was finally ready to see it. When I returned home that afternoon, I slipped Thomas's envelope into the drawer of my nightstand without breaking the seal. Every instinct urged me to open it immediately, yet Michael's quiet reminder echoed in my mind. Patience reveals what emotion hides. Thomas had trusted that advice enough to leave it as one of his final instructions, and after 42 years together I had learned that his patience almost always uncovered truths the rest of us overlooked. By early evening, Daniel and Rebecca arrived carrying shopping bags and several folders. Rebecca smiled as though nothing unusual had happened over the past few days. She set a takeout dinner on the kitchen counter and announced that she thought it would be easier if nobody had to cook for a while. It was a thoughtful gesture on the surface, yet before I even opened the containers, she had already spread documents across the dining room table. "We should start simplifying everything," she said pleasantly. "There are so many responsibilities now, and it would probably be less stressful if Daniel and I handled most of them." I quietly served myself a small portion of soup and listened without interrupting. Rebecca explained that utility accounts should eventually be transferred, insurance policies reviewed, and household expenses consolidated. She spoke with the confidence of someone describing decisions that had already been made rather than possibilities that deserved discussion. Daniel remained mostly silent, occasionally nodding while scrolling through emails on his telephone. Every now and then, he looked toward me with an expression that reminded me of the little boy who used to ask permission before borrowing my gardening gloves. That uncertainty was still there beneath the surface, but it disappeared each time Rebecca continued speaking. After dinner, she carried several empty folders into Thomas's office and asked whether I still had the spare key to the filing cabinet. I answered honestly that I did not know where it was. That was partially true because Thomas had always kept important keys himself. Rebecca frowned for only a moment before recovering her smile. "That is all right," she replied. "We will figure it out." The words sounded harmless, yet I noticed she did not ask whether I wanted to look for the key together. Instead, she immediately began opening drawers and cabinets again, searching methodically through shelves she had already examined the previous day. Standing quietly in the hallway, I realized she was not exploring. She was looking for something specific. I remember Thomas once telling me that people searching for memories move slowly, but people searching for advantage always know exactly where to begin. Later that night, I walked into the laundry room and discovered several cardboard boxes stacked neatly beside the back door. One was labeled donation. Another simply read storage. Inside the first box rested framed photographs from our bedroom, Thomas's old leather boots, his favorite fishing vest, and several books he had read every winter. My breath caught. None of those things had been discussed with me. I gently lifted the framed photograph from our 25th anniversary and carried it back upstairs. Rebecca appeared behind me before I reached the landing. "I thought removing some personal items might help you heal," she said softly. I looked at the photograph instead of at her. "Healing and erasing are not the same thing," I answered quietly. She offered a polite smile but said nothing more. For the first time since the funeral, I noticed a brief flash of irritation crossing her face before it disappeared. That single moment told me more than any argument could have. She had expected agreement, not resistance. The following morning, another small incident confirmed what I had begun to suspect. I reached for the house keys hanging beside the garage door, only to discover one key missing. Rebecca calmly explained that she had made a spare because contractors might need access if repairs became necessary. Repairs had never been discussed. Neither had contractors. Yet every explanation she offered sounded practical enough that questioning it would make me appear unreasonable. I finally understood why Thomas had urged patience instead of confrontation. Individually, each decision appeared thoughtful. Together they formed a quiet transfer of control, one ordinary choice at a time. I said nothing for the rest of the morning. Instead, I watched carefully, listened closely, and remembered every detail. Somewhere inside the sealed envelope waiting upstairs, Thomas had promised me answers. Until then, I would give Rebecca exactly what she believed she wanted. A widow too overwhelmed by grief to notice how quickly someone else was trying to rewrite the life we had spent more than 4 decades building together. 2 mornings later, I finally carried Thomas's sealed envelope into the den before sunrise. The entire house remained quiet except for the steady ticking of the old mantel clock he had repaired countless times over the years. I placed the envelope carefully on the coffee table and rested both hands beside it. For several long minutes, I simply looked at his handwriting. I had seen those familiar letters on birthday cards, grocery lists, anniversary notes, and the labels he placed on every box in the garage. Somehow they made him feel close enough to speak again. With a slow breath, I gently broke the seal and unfolded several neatly typed pages along with one handwritten letter resting on top. The first line immediately brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, then you have already shown the patience I knew you possessed." I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat before continuing. Thomas wrote exactly as he had always spoken, calm, thoughtful, never wasting a word. He explained that illness had forced him to consider possibilities he hoped would never become reality. He did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, he described patterns he had quietly observed during the previous year. He noticed increasing interest in financial records, repeated suggestions that household responsibilities should gradually shift away from us, and subtle attempts to separate us from decisions we had always made together. He admitted that each incident seemed harmless alone, but together they convinced him to prepare carefully rather than emotionally. Beneath the letter rested a second document listing several folders, safety deposit records, certified copies of legal papers, and the names of 2 financial institutions. Every item included precise dates and reference numbers. Thomas had organized everything with remarkable care. At the bottom, he had written one final instruction in blue ink. Do not reveal what you know until everyone else has revealed themselves first. I read that sentence 3 times. Suddenly, every strange conversation during his final months made perfect sense. He had never been speaking in riddles. He had been protecting me without creating unnecessary conflict while he was still alive. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. I quietly returned every document to the envelope just before Rebecca called my name from the hallway. She entered carrying another folder and smiled warmly.
Good morning, she said.
I spoke with someone who can help us move everything along much faster. I slipped the envelope into the drawer beside my chair before turning toward her. Move what along? I asked gently. The estate, she answered without hesitation. The sooner everything is transferred, the easier life will be for everyone. Her confidence surprised me less than it had only a few days earlier. Now I understood exactly why she seemed so eager. She believed speed worked in her favor.
She
believed confusion would prevent careful questions. I simply nodded and thanked her for letting me know. Throughout breakfast, I quietly observed every conversation. Rebecca repeatedly mentioned appointments, deadlines, signatures, and practical decisions that supposedly could not wait. Daniel listened, but contributed very little. His shoulders seemed heavier every day, as though some quiet uncertainty was beginning to grow inside him. More than once I caught him studying my face before quickly looking away. He looked like a man trying to convince himself that everything happening around him was reasonable even while something deep inside whispered otherwise. That afternoon my telephone rang once again. It was Michael. He asked whether I had opened the envelope. When I answered yes, he remained silent for several seconds before saying, "Then you are ready for the next step." He explained that Thomas had instructed him to schedule a formal family meeting exactly 1 week after the funeral, regardless of whether anyone believed it necessary. Several documents could only be presented during that meeting because Thomas insisted every interested person hear the same information at the same time. Michael's voice remained calm, but I sensed quiet confidence beneath every word. Before ending the call, he added one final sentence. Thomas believed that truth carries far more weight when everyone is present to hear it together. After hanging up, I walked onto the back porch and watched the afternoon wind carry golden leaves across the lawn Thomas had cared for every Saturday morning. For the first time since saying goodbye to him, I no longer felt like someone drifting through grief without direction. The path ahead remained uncertain, but it was no longer hidden. Thomas had already laid every stepping stone before me. All I had to do now was keep walking exactly as he had trusted I would. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon in Michael Harper's conference room overlooking the town square. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying only my handbag and Thomas's envelope. Michael greeted me with the same calm professionalism he had shown our family for decades. He did not ask whether I felt nervous. Instead, he simply poured 2 cups of coffee and reminded me that today was about facts, not feelings. His quiet confidence steadied my heart more than any comforting words could have. One by one, the others arrived. Daniel entered first, looking tired and distracted, his tie slightly crooked as though he had dressed without paying attention. Rebecca followed close behind, carrying a thick leather portfolio filled with neatly organized papers. She smiled politely at Michael before taking the chair closest to the head of the conference table without waiting for anyone else to sit. That small decision alone revealed more than she probably realized. She already pictured herself directing the meeting. After everyone settled into their seats, Michael folded his hands and thanked us for coming. He explained that Thomas had left very specific instructions regarding the order in which certain matters were to be addressed. Rebecca nodded confidently and immediately slid several documents across the polished table. To save everyone time, she said pleasantly, I have already prepared a list of assets that should be transferred and responsibilities that Daniel and I are ready to manage. Michael glanced briefly at the papers, but did not touch them. "Thank you," he replied evenly. "However, we will begin with Mr. Sullivan's written instructions." A flicker of surprise crossed Rebecca's face before she recovered her smile. Michael opened one of his own folders and carefully removed a certified document bearing Thomas's signature. He explained that before discussing any property or financial accounts, Thomas had required an inventory of official records already secured with independent institutions. Rebecca shifted slightly in her chair. "I was under the impression everything important was already here at the house," she said. Michael calmly shook his head. "Your impression was incomplete." Silence settled over the room. Michael continued reading from Thomas's written directions, listing certified copies of property deeds, investment statements, insurance records, trust documents, and personal instructions that had been stored separately months before his passing. Every item included dates, witness signatures, and independent verification. I watched Rebecca's expression carefully. The confidence she had worn since the funeral began giving way to quiet uncertainty. She opened her portfolio and quickly compared several pages before looking back toward Michael. "There must be some mistake," she said. "Those records were never mentioned." Michael met her eyes without raising his voice. "That is correct. Mr. Sullivan intentionally kept certain records confidential until this meeting." Daniel looked from Michael to Rebecca, clearly trying to understand why his father would have taken such extraordinary precautions. I gently reached into my handbag and placed Thomas's handwritten letter on the table beside me, saying nothing. I did not need to. Its presence alone reminded me that none of this had happened by accident. Michael then presented another folder containing chronological notes Thomas had prepared during the previous year. They were not accusations or complaints. They were simple observations documenting conversations, financial recommendations, proposed account changes, and requests that had been made regarding family property. Everything was factual. Every date matched supporting records. Every note reflected Thomas's careful habit of documenting important decisions without emotion. Daniel slowly leaned forward, reading several pages as Michael passed them around the table. His forehead tightened with growing concern. More than once he looked toward Rebecca as though waiting for an explanation that never came. She remained remarkably composed, but I noticed she stopped interrupting the discussion. For the first time since Thomas passed away, someone else controlled the direction of the conversation. Michael finally closed the folder and looked around the room. "Today's purpose was never to distribute assets," he said quietly. "Today's purpose was to establish the complete record before any final decisions are implemented." Rebecca lowered her eyes toward the unopened documents inside her portfolio. They suddenly seemed far less important than they had only an hour earlier. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the conference table, I realized the balance inside the room had shifted without a single raised voice. Thomas had not prepared an argument. He had prepared the truth. And truth, presented patiently and completely, had begun accomplishing exactly what he believed it would. The conference room remained silent long after Michael closed the final folder. Nobody seemed eager to be the first person to speak. Outside the tall windows, people crossed the town square carrying shopping bags and greeting neighbors, completely unaware that an entire family's future had quietly shifted inside that room. Michael adjusted his glasses before reaching for one final sealed envelope that had remained untouched throughout the meeting. He looked directly at me before breaking the seal. "Mr. Sullivan instructed me to read this only after the supporting documents had been presented," he said calmly. I folded my hands together and listened. Thomas's familiar words filled the room once again. He explained that love should never require blind trust and that respect could never survive where manipulation replaced honesty. He wrote that every decision he had made during his final months was intended to protect the people he loved while giving everyone an equal opportunity to reveal their own character. Then Michael unfolded another page. It contained the final legal instructions governing Thomas's estate. The family home would remain in my name for the rest of my life, free from outside control or forced sale. Every investment account had already been transferred into a trust that named me as the primary beneficiary, with carefully defined protections preventing unauthorized changes. Several additional accounts designated for Daniel would remain inaccessible until specific legal conditions had been satisfied. None of those conditions involved Rebecca. A long silence followed. Rebecca stared at the documents in front of her without speaking. The confidence that had surrounded her since the funeral had quietly disappeared. She finally looked toward Michael. "Why was none of this disclosed earlier?" she asked, her voice noticeably softer than before. Michael answered without hesitation. "Because Mr. Sullivan specifically instructed that these documents be presented only after enough time had passed for everyone's actions to speak for themselves." Daniel lowered his head into his hands. He remained there for several seconds before slowly turning toward me. His eyes were filled not with anger, but with regret. "Mom," he whispered, "I should have listened to Dad more carefully." Hearing those words hurt far less than I expected. Grief had already taught me that blame rarely repaired anything. I simply reached across the table and rested my hand over his. "Your father always believed people could learn," I said quietly. "That is why he planned instead of accusing." Rebecca remained motionless. She never argued with the documents because there was nothing to argue against. Every page carried signatures, dates, witnesses, and records prepared months before anyone imagined this meeting would ever take place. Facts left very little room for interpretation. Michael gathered the completed files into orderly stacks before asking whether anyone had additional questions. Nobody answered. The meeting ended not with raised voices or dramatic confrontations, but with quiet acceptance that the truth had finally replaced assumptions. When we stepped outside, the cool autumn air felt lighter than it had in weeks. Daniel offered to drive me home. During the ride, he apologized more than once for allowing himself to become distracted while Rebecca handled nearly every family decision after Thomas became ill. I told him healing would take time for all of us, but time had always been one of his father's greatest teachers. As we turned onto my street, golden leaves drifted across the front yard exactly as they had every autumn since Thomas planted the maple tree more than 30 years earlier. I unlocked the front door and walked slowly through the familiar hallway. The framed anniversary photograph had returned to its place. Thomas's favorite chair waited beside the fireplace exactly where it belonged. Nothing inside the house felt empty anymore. His voice no longer echoed through the rooms, yet his wisdom remained in every thoughtful decision he had quietly made long before saying goodbye. That evening I carried his final handwritten letter onto the back porch where we had shared thousands of sunsets together. I read the closing sentence one last time before carefully folding the paper and placing it inside its envelope. Real wealth is leaving behind peace instead of conflict and truth instead of fear. I looked across the quiet yard and smiled through grateful tears. Rebecca had believed she could claim everything that mattered. In the end, the only thing Thomas truly wanted anyone to inherit was integrity, and that was the one treasure nobody could ever take away.